In this instance, two things can be true. I can disagree with your viewpoint, and I can still respect you as a friend. Like I said before, love is not necessarily contingent upon agreement or affirmation. You know, I can disagree with somebody's views and still respect and love that person in a healthy relationship. We just have to remind ourselves of that both things can be true. I can disagree with what you said, and that doesn't have to take away with how I look at you as a person, as a man, as a father, as a child, as a coworker, as a friend, you know.
Welcome back to the Present Fathers Podcast. We are very excited to introduce our guest, Philip Blackett, to you. He is a husband, father, highly accomplished professional, and very skilled at managing disagreement without being disrespectful. So with that, Philip, welcome to the Present Fathers Podcast. We are pumped to have you. How are you, man?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, George and Brandon. Happy to be here. Happy to have this conversation with you guys.
Yeah, man, looking forward to it. And I think especially with your background, you can bridge a lot of gaps for a lot of people in our culture today. And so I'm very excited to kind of unpack some of that with you today. Why don't we start with just introduce yourself to the audience, who you are, tell us a little bit about your family, and we can go over some of your background.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question to start off with because you think about it and you say, hey, listen, I've been here for about close to 40 years. It'll be in November. And try to condense all that into like 1 or 2 minutes so you don't bore anybody. It's
luck.
kind of a tall task to do outside of raising kids. But I just say this, listen, my name is Philip, born and raised in Memphis, went to school in North Carolina, so clearly a Southerner at heart, so lover of all things barbecue, sweet tea, Chick-fil-A related. Went to work up in New York City on Wall Street for a little bit. Did some research analyst job for stocks and bonds up there. Did some other corporate gigs, some entrepreneur stuff. Long story short, went back to school in Boston, got my MBA. I got my MRS afterwards. That is my wife. We got married the day after graduation. And then I got it's not an MRS for them. I'll just say just two misses, as far as like twin daughters, first year after getting married. They're now 7, starting second grade later on this year.
All right.
And I think at this point where for me, as I'm approaching 40, I think a lot of people kind of look at that as that halfway point. And so if you're blessed enough to reach to that age, you start to think about, what was the first half, God willing, your life about? And you start thinking about what the second half of your life is going to be about afterwards. And I think a lot of things come up top of mind for me. We could definitely discuss more, but more so in the sense of you're thinking about purpose, you're thinking about legacy, you're thinking about, how do you leave this world better than you found it? That Scouts mentality. And so that's definitely a big focus of where I'm at this point.
Yeah, man. Well, appreciate you condensing 40 years into about 2 minutes there. Well done. And to that point about like legacy and leaving this world a better place than you entered it, I think a big element of that is as men today, we need to be a lot more effective at bringing people together, right? And I think everything today is so polarized and so divisive, and it's the news, it's social media and everything. I would actually love to start with, you've written a book on it about disagreement, how to do it effectively. I think this is a great perspective that pretty much every American needs, not just fathers, but I think as men and fathers today, we need to take a more active role in actually deconstructing the tribalism that exists. And so I'd love to just kind of tell us about the book a little bit and then kind of what your area of expertise is and how, the average guy can do better.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, George. And the funny thing is I've answered that question more than once before, but I think taking it from this type of lens and perspective is particularly unique and helpful. When you think about men, you think about husbands, you think about fathers, you think about grandfathers. I think about it in terms of men setting the tone. Because oftentimes, biblically speaking, it was men that were first here that were tasked as far as how to handle the first family. And if we're being honest with ourselves as far as what the good book says, we didn't do such a good job. And we're still in the midst of trying to recover from that. A great man of God, literally the Son of God, had to come in to show us the right way. And I think of it in the sense of, the best example we possibly can have. Clearly, my book doesn't hold water compared to his. So right. I just do what I can humbly to say, listen, I think a lot of where our society and our culture comes from is in part from our families and in part from our fathers and our husbands. And so my thought is that, I don't own a media network. I don't own Facebook. But I do know that as for me and my house, I got a wife and 2 daughters to take care of. And more than likely, their relationship with me is going to predicate how they interact with other people and other men. And so I think if anything we can have an influence on as men is the families that we raise, the families that we are part of, the women we love, the kids we raise. And a big part of that is dealing with the fact that, the quality of our lives are often measured by the quality of our relationships. And when you think about the quality of the relationships that mean a lot to you, I think about it from the standpoint of, oftentimes these are relationships that have stood the test of time, right? And people that you have opened yourself up to, that you care a lot about, that know you much deeper than most people see on the outside. And I would also respectfully point out as well, these are also people that know the good, bad, and ugly about you. And you also have probably navigated your own disagreements on, meaning that you've been with people for so long that I can almost guarantee you there's some things you agree on, and there's definitely some things you don't agree on. Yeah. But the odd thing about it is that one way or the other, you're still together, which is odd in this society now, which thinks that love is contingent on agreement and affirmation. That lie is not serving us as a society. No. It's definitely helping raise, if anything, a very much a Kleenex snowflake type of generation, so to speak. I wasn't raised in that sort of world. I was raised in a world where it's understandable that there's disagreement, and that the grandfather that raised me, he had a certain viewpoint. He was unapologetic about it. He was respectful about it, but you knew where he stood, and you respected that. And there was a good reason behind that. And if you agree with it, great. And if you didn't, it doesn't bother him at all. And so I think that to have that type of standard, have those type of principles are important as men. And even more so the sense that because we live in a polarizing world, it's helpful for us as men to understand and be able to teach and model for people that it is still possible for us to disagree with one another and still respect and love that person in a healthy relationship.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that happens in our society today is that social media and all the other things pull people away from being oriented towards people that they love, and paints a picture and a thought process, kind of a mind virus, if you will, that just slowly and subtly seeps in and just continuously grows on that person's mindset, to the point where when there is something that opposes that thought process, there's cognitive dissonance at such a great length that they feel this almost a traumatic trigger response, right? And then they just immediately go to you're a hateful person, you're this. They go to ad hominem, right? Because that dissonance is so strong, and they're not willing to check it, because they've gotten so wrapped up into what they've seen on a daily basis through these, social medias, like especially shorts, like shorts and reels and stuff like that. Like those are so bad at influencing people and eliminating critical thinking, in my opinion. And I've seen it time and time again. And it's like, I can almost detect when those talking points occur from somebody when I'm trying to debate something with somebody. And it's like, well, okay, what do you think about this? And you kind of test that critical thinking, and it's like, it's non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I have to give people a certain measure of grace, because I know that in the world we live in now, it's just so heavily saturated with that, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a completely different cultural phenomenon, because essentially what happens is the culture, the media are influencing and educating and teaching us how to go about interacting with one another. So we think about it in a sense, like the way to talk to each other is 140 characters or less, or 60 seconds or less. It's one of those things that you can't really elaborate, or people aren't, used to actually having a full blown conversation, because you're so used to doing it in sound bites and tweets. And so I think that's part of it too, where it's like, when you condition a group of people that way, it often has us swimming upstream than trying to expose them to something better, let alone an actual conversation, back and forth dialogue, where you're exploring each other's viewpoints, especially if you look at things differently.
Do you think a lot of the issues we see today, especially when things get heated, is just a lack of, I wouldn't say discernment, but maybe an emotional intelligence, one, to be able to frame things properly and to control, like, because when you get upset and you're clashing with somebody verbally, right, you're gonna have this natural knee-jerk reaction to get emotional, right, and then the logic kind of goes out the door. So I'm trying to think of how I can frame this. Give me just a moment here.
There's a lack of understanding of each other.
Yeah. Almost like there's like a disconnect completely from the other person.
So I think two things come to mind. Lack of understanding can be one. I think even more so, there's a greater sense of insecurity taking place. And what I mean by that, guys, is that if you had an understanding that people you talk to, you already knew are going to likely think of things similar to you and differently, then that's just a part of expectation. Where you get to the point where it's like disagreement shouldn't shock you. It shouldn't surprise you, right? That's part of the joy of learning about somebody new. Like, I'm getting to meet George and Brandon. What I know off the top of my head is if I spend enough time with both of these guys, I can guarantee you two things. One, we're bound to find a number of topics that you and I feel like we're like brothers on, in complete agreement on. Another thing I can guarantee you on, there's probably going to be some topics that you and I are on opposite sides of the spectrum on. So if I come into that conversation knowing that on the front end, I'm already expecting to find places of common ground between us, and things that diversity of thought can actually exist. And it's not a bad thing. It's actually expected. The problem is we don't have enough people having that same sort of mindset of saying, hey, disagreement is to be expected, and it's okay, and it's an opportunity to get to know somebody beyond the surface. But if you have that insecurity of thinking that everything has to work out your way, every domino has to line up, which is almost impossible to go upon, then you do open yourself up to being traumatized because somebody has a different point of view. Because you might have been so much thinking that everyone has to be on the same wavelength as you, but it's unrealistic and it's unfortunate,
Yeah, I think part of the element of it is kind of the illusion of control, right? It's like if your way is always winning and everyone thinks like you feel like you're in control, and the fact that someone may disagree, and I'm using you generally, just people in general. If someone disagrees with another, it kind of shatters that illusion that like you're in control of everything, right? Because in reality, you're in control of basically nothing. And I think that is an element of our culture where we've been conditioned to think you have to control everything. And in reality, you can basically control one thing, you. Like, even if you're married, you can't control your spouse. You
Yep.
can't even control your kids. Like, you
Yep.
can guide them, but you can't control them. So I think that's a big element of it too, is there's just so much we've believed that lie that you can control all these things, and you just can't. And I think that sets you up to what you were just describing too, where people are going in with this false expectation that there won't be any disagreement. So the title of the book is Disagree Without Disrespect: How to Respectfully Debate with Those Who Think, Believe, and Vote Differently from You. And you outline a 5-step framework. So why don't we walk over that, because I think this will like really help drive this conversation forward, and we can kind of build off of that 5-step framework.
Yep. So step one is essentially we have to separate the idea or belief from the identity of the believer. And the reason why that's key is because depending on the person you talk to or the topic at hand, that topic may be so much a part of that person. They may be so intertwined with what that issue is that it essentially becomes who he or she is. And the challenge behind that, guys, is that if I were to disagree with that belief, then that person may more than likely think I'm disagreeing with who he or she is. If I criticize that idea and I tell you why I think it's wrong, or why I don't like it, or don't think it works, then that person may take it as like I'm criticizing who that person is, or that I'm hating that person. And the problem with that is, if that's the case, you can't blame that person if he or she then gets defensive, starts to build a wall up, maybe gets aggressive towards you, or even tries to get personal and start name calling because they're trying to save face, especially if it's a public setting, or protect whatever ego they have left. But the challenge with that is that once you get into name calling, there's no more debate at this point. You've gotten personal. And now it's every person for him or herself. And so that's where things just no longer become fruitful or worth pursuing at that point.
We interrupt this episode to talk about Synthesis Tutor, the world's first superhuman math tutor. It is warm, patient, and understanding, and adapts to your child so you never have to worry about them falling behind when it comes to math. In episode 84, we spoke to Chrisman Frank, the CEO of Synthesis, and immediately afterwards, I purchased Synthesis Tutor for my daughter, and it has been an absolute game changer for us. Math used to be a very painful experience. It was frustrating, and there was lots of tears for my daughter when it came to learning math. It's something she's not naturally good at, and we struggled a lot. Now she happily uses Synthesis Tutor every single week, and there's no more frustrating nights. The way it works is that it leverages AI to adapt the experience to your child to not simply master memorization of math facts, but it actually teaches the principles and concepts so that your child can independently solve problems without needing tons of outside help. Because it tailors the experience to your child, it is always adapting and learning where the child is in terms of their development, and it keeps them in the proximal zone of learning so that your child is being challenged but not getting frustrated or defeated by the experience. I am very pleased with our experience on Synthesis Tutor. My daughter's grades have improved in math. It's something that I can now outsource. I don't have to take the time myself to sit there and try and memorize facts with her. She gets excited to do it, and it's fun and engaging for her to learn instead of this frustrating experience, and it doesn't feel like a chore any longer. So we at the Present Fathers podcast highly endorse Synthesis Tutor. There is also a Teams function for those with multiple kids or maybe multiple families want to pool their children together. You can check that out on the website. You can get 10% off with your purchase by going to synthesis.com/PFP. That's synthesis.com/PFP. Go there, check it out, and start supercharging your child's learning experience with the power of AI. Back to the episode. Yeah. So just to recap, so you said it was separate the idea from the identity?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. I like that a lot. And, you know, we are going to probably stray into a little bit of politics here, especially with your background. But, you know, I think that's a big element today, too, is everything's identity politics now, right? It's all about your identity and nothing about the idea, which is insane. It's absolute insanity, because whatever color you are, whatever religion you're a part of, whatever, you know what I mean, like whatever your background is, to bottle a person into that tiny little check, that box, is the most reductive way of thinking that you could possibly engage in. I mean, it blows my mind that it's so pervasive in our culture today. And that's not a right or left issue. It's on any subject, because you can be conservative and do the exact same thing. This isn't woke versus whatever. It's anyone doing this. You're doing the exact opposite of what you just described, and it's so destructive, because you dehumanize a person and make them a caricature of what they are, based off of a very base identical factor. And it's just totally disingenuous to anyone. And so I think that's really what you're preaching to avoid here with that point, right? Is drawing out of that. So that's a really good point, because I think it's so pervasive. We need to stop doing that really quickly.
Well, the other part of it too, George, is that it's also a lazy way of thinking. And
yeah, that's right.
I know you talked about dehumanizing. I think the other part of it too is, God created us so uniquely, and we're like him in his image. How dare we limit ourselves and oversimplify ourselves to the point that we think that we are no longer multidimensional human beings, capable of thinking and acting in a number of different ways. But we're basically saying to somebody, because you are of a certain skin color, or because you have XY chromosomes, or because you're from a particular region, or you believe a certain way, then that's essentially all I need to know to then extrapolate how you're likely to think, believe, and vote or act in any given situation. That everyone is a monolith in that point, just based off what you see on the outside, knowing that, just like what we can see in the natural, that's such a limited perspective compared to what we cannot see. And that applies to us as people too. There's so much that goes on beyond what I can see physically with George and Brandon. But if I never take upon it myself to learn beyond the surface and what I can actually physically see, I'm actually doing myself a huge disservice of not being able to understand all of what makes you who you are. And I think, unfortunately, because of how society and culture works, it's also a part of what they want us to be. They want us to make these snap judgments and think that we know everything off of one person's like appearance, and that can't be further than the truth.
Do you think that a lot of it has to do with the lack of intellectual curiosity, but also towards the lack of intellectual curiosity for other people and their story? Because I find, like, for me, I have to be willing to hear another person's story to gain a certain amount of empathy and understanding to why they believe a certain thing, or to be able to bridge the gap between those differences.
I think you're spot on. I mean, I think that was what people used to think liberal arts universities were all about. The point of college was, a quote unquote liberal arts education to help teach you how to think.
Yeah.
Not necessarily what to think, but how to think in terms of that intellectual curiosity, not taking everything upon face value, scientific method, critical thinking, research, analysis, like what are the results behind it, hearing the backstory on why someone would make this type of decision, all these different type of things. Yeah, it takes a little time, and I think a lot of people are impatient. They want to rush to judgment and jump to conclusions. However, at the same time, just taking a little bit of time to learn a little bit more about the situation at hand or the person you're talking to, you'd be surprised how much you can learn. But you can never bridge that gap if you don't at least have that curiosity intact to want to, pursue.
Yeah. And I will admit, the conditioning that we have towards being very judgmental about, identity, is very strong, and we've had people reach out for this show that we're doing right now, and my initial reaction is kind of like, I don't know, like I have that kind of initial reaction, and then after talking to them, like, holy cow, I can't believe I thought that about, what I mean? And I've been really convicted about the fact that even that thought crept in my mind for just a fleeting moment, right? And so even if you're very attuned to trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, it's like, it's very hard to overcome. So I can understand why people struggle with it, but I think it's important that we really start putting effort there collectively, especially as men. Like you said, we set the tone. I love that. Men, yeah, you're leaders. You set the tone where you go. So if you don't engage in it, it starts to show others like, hey, let's not do that. Okay, I think we got step one really good. What's step two?
So step two is basically disagree with the idea of belief and still respect and love the believer.
Okay.
In this instance, two things can be true. I can disagree with your viewpoint, and I can still respect you as a friend.
Right.
Like I said before, love is not necessarily contingent upon agreement or affirmation. I can disagree with somebody's views and still respect and love that person in a healthy relationship. But that's not what society wants to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's that multi-dimensional part that we talked about, where it's just like, I can still coexist and work with you on the same team at work, or we can still hang out and get a burger or a drink, and we just watch a debate and we were on polar opposites. And people think that that's not possible. That's like sleeping with the enemy. Well, newsflash, that was the case beforehand. I've seen plenty of examples growing up, and history would say it too, of people being on polar opposites, let's pick politically, and they'll still get together at each other's like functions or have dinner and that sort of thing. People can still compete. Like, you watch sports today, right? You have teams that can compete, superstars that can compete against each other, and they can still like hang out after the game and that sort. So it's not that that's not possible. I think we just have to remind ourselves that both things can be true. I can disagree with what you said, and that doesn't have to take away with how I look at you as a person, as a man, as a father, as a child, as a coworker, as a friend, And I think what helps with that too is if you help people understand that, then what that does is it disarms them, knowing that I can actually have a conversation with you guys, and I don't have to fear all of a sudden this is going to be my last conversation with you.
Right.
Because we disagreed, now you're going to write me off or unfollow me or unfriend me or lose my number, just because we saw things differently. Like, if I knew that we're still going to be cool afterwards, we're still going to hang out, we're still going to like talk, then that probably allows people to take their guard down and say, hey, okay, here's where I think about this, honestly. Right or wrong, like, help me understand this. Here's the questions I have. Being able to open oneself up to you in that sense, but people won't do that if they don't feel like they're in a safe space to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've found, as I've grown as a man, as a leader, that intentionally including people in my circle who have differing beliefs and views on many different things is highly beneficial, because it forces me to reevaluate my own beliefs constantly, whether it's about business or politics or whatever the subject. It just forces you to be a little bit sharper, because it's not necessarily battle, but it's like a little bit of contention drives you forward in a good way, especially as a man, right? As men, having that kind of sparring between close friends that you build a relationship with, you may still be at an impasse and not ever agree on the thing, but having that hearty debate forces you to understand yourself even better, and keep yourself accountable, basically. So that's part of brotherhood that we talk about so much on this show. Is so important, is you learn to really solidify why you believe what you believe about anything, and you'll perform at a higher level as a result, because now you know that your conviction is that much stronger, right? Mm-hmm. And to your point, you still love the person. You can disagree with the belief. So I love that step 2. That's a very good strategy that men need to be applying more. What's step 3?
So once you set the bar with those first two steps, now we can actually debate the issue at hand. But the focus we have on debating the issue is more so based on anything else. I know some people might think of this as a 4-letter word, but it's actually 5. It's the M word. It's on merit. What do I mean by merit? I mean, let's have a conversation about this issue based off of what are the facts? What's the logic? What's the research behind this? What's the analysis? What did you find out? What's the performance? What were the results? Key on the results. Try to make this as objective of a comparison of an analysis as possible, an apples to apples comparison. Which one is truly better? Because what you don't want to get involved with is you don't want to get entangled in name calling and making it personal. You don't want to get involved with over drawn out emotional reactions where I'm looking for a Kleenex to wipe Brandon's eyes because I simply say, I don't think your idea is going to work.
Yeah, I think it falls into this trap of acceptance. Man's heart always wanting the acceptance of others, especially peers or anybody that you even have a remote, small amount of respect for. There's this seeking urgent feeling like I have to have the acceptance of others at all costs. And I think what they do is they seek that acceptance in these groups and in these tribalistic ideological points, and they anchor everything in those identities because they want that acceptance. They're chasing that, right? Mm-hmm. And then they are so avoidant of truth and logic that goes against what they love and that they feel is part of their identity, because they got to pull back the layer, and there could be some hurt, there could be some traumas, there could be things in the past, or there could be things that would make them feel like they're vulnerable, right? And me and George talk about it all the time. It's kind of a phrasing that I've coined called courageous transparency. So like when I give my ideas, I'm being courageously transparent. I'm showing people what I really think. I'm taking off the mask. The Japanese talk about it. They say that a man has 3 masks, right? And so you got to take your mask off, and you got to show people the real you and what you think and believe. And I think a lot of people are scared to do that, right? I think they're afraid that it's going to alienate them instead of bring them closer to somebody, when usually it's the opposite, right?
Yep. And I think another thing I'll add to it too, Brandon, is, when I unmask myself and I share something that's close to me, close to heart, or something that's putting me in a transparent, vulnerable, honest, or open fashion, I just gave you a gift, because it's something that I didn't have to do. It's something that I took risk to do, that I don't know in advance how that's going to be received. And oftentimes what happens is, once I've given that gift to you, I'm now looking at you to determine how you are going to respect that gift I just gave you.
Yeah.
Because that's going to tell me, do I share more with you? Do I disclose more? Do I unmask even further? Or do I say, nope, I learned my lesson there, I got burned, we're just going to stop it here? And then they wonder why we can't get beyond how's the weather and how's your kids type of conversation.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's a big part of it too, to be able to do that. Because I don't know if people realize this, but you probably shouldn't be so quick to, tear somebody down once they share something with you, because they're actually looking at you and evaluating, can I trust you with what was on my mind? Can I trust you with what's honest about how I think about things?
Wow. So give us the gift of number 4, because I'm loving these so far.
Yep. So the gift of number 4 is, after you've had a debate based off merit, right? We should do what we did as young people when we played sports. Like, what did we do, win or lose, as a team when we finished the game?
Lined up and high-five the other team and shake hands or whatever.
Yep. Shake hands, said good game, and, moved on from there. Like, I think the I never quite understood, why would you teach some kids to do that if you didn't think there was some value in that lesson for them to take on later? Like, the thought that goes in my head, guys, is that good sportsmanship is appreciated when we're young, and good sportsmanship should be exhibited and carried over when we're adults too.
I agree completely.
Because nobody likes a sore loser. Mm-hmm. Nobody likes a sore winner. So if you're able to come off of this debate or discussion and say, you know what, George, thanks so much for sharing this with me. I know it wasn't easy. I definitely learned some things about where you're coming from and the backstory behind why this position is so important to you. And even if we don't still see eye to eye, I can appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Yeah.
Like, how do you think conversations and debates would be had going forward if we had that sort of sense of gratitude for somebody to open up and have that conversation, take the time? You know, I think one thing that comes up top of mind for me that makes me really grateful about that is we live more in a world, guys, now that people want to have these quote unquote conversations over texting. It's why, like, the comment section in social media is like horrendous.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I made a post a day or two ago, and people on my network were like, hey, this seems kind of broad. Can you share with me what you think more in detail in the comment section? No. You want to know why? No. Because it's a trap.
Yeah.
It's a trap because the moment I start to share that, it leads it for everyone else to be, I'm exposed to people that I may not have wanted to trust that gift with, as far as understanding more transparency, that they can just nitpick in that sort. But what I often don't see, and it sticks out like a sore thumb with me when it does happen, rarely, but it does. When someone takes the time to pick up the phone or get on a Zoom call or meet in person for lunch and actually have a conversation, just you and him or her. That's why number 4 is so helpful and so meaningful to me, because most people don't even want to take the time to even have a conversation with you about this. Yeah. They just want to share their piece in the comments, like or dislike, and think that they've done themselves a service. And so being able to have that good sportsmanship to say, hey, you know, we can walk away from this, and I'll lead this into step number 5, being able to respect and love the person afterwards. And even if you disagree, chalk it up as diversity of thought. But more importantly, keep the door open to continue the conversation. Hopefully this is more of a dialogue that isn't a one-time thing. Because oftentimes what happens is those relationships that mean so much to us, oftentimes in those relationships we realize the relationship itself is actually more important for us than whether one was right or wrong.
Yeah.
And oftentimes you keep the door open to continue the conversation. You continue to get to know each other. You continue to talk about the topic. But what also happens too, that's pretty remarkable, every time you keep that door open, you continually build a little bit more into that relationship.
That's right. Yeah. A phrase, I did Taekwondo very competitively when I was younger, and there was a phrase that we had to live by where it was humble in victory and honorable in defeat. So to like point 4, that I think that really ties into that well. And, you know, we like to gloat a lot. You know, we showboat and like with social media, everyone puts on their best face, right? There's a lot of temptation to brag, right? And yeah, so even if you are winning, you just make people dislike you, and you're not winning over, you're not influencing, you're actually repelling people. And so kind of having that humble heart, even if you are kind of quote unquote right or winning or whatever, helps bridge that gap, right? To maybe influence someone if they're stuck in a way of wrong think that's actually damaging their life, and you're genuinely trying to hurt them. being holier than thou isn't going to win them over. There has to be, common ground built up and relationship built, to your point. And also the reason why like texting and all that kind of stuff is terrible is, one, most communication is nonverbal. Like even now that we're not in person, we're seeing facial expressions, we're kind of hearing the inflections of our voice. Like there's still a little bit more communicating going on other than just the words we're using. So that's a huge element why is you're missing most of it. Like 93% or something is nonverbal.
Yep.
The second piece there is it's really hard to be mean to someone face to face. It takes a lot more courage to be like really, rude to someone, and maybe it's misguided courage, but it takes a lot more of that, or anger, whatever the motivation is, in person versus, over the internet.
Yep.
And I think most people don't actually believe a lot of what they say. It's very easy to be hateful and rude because there's no cost. And so when you're in person, doing that consistently, one, heals you a lot. We need that interaction with people. Even if you're an introvert, you need that kind of, like Brandon here, my esteemed colleague, is a pretty introverted guy, but we talk a lot because it heals both of us in that exchange, even if we're disagreeing on something. And I kind of forgot the second piece there. The in-person connection, there's no replacement for it. And so if you're only ever living in digital texting and everything, you're really hurting yourself. It's not even just about debate or winning arguments or any of that kind of stuff. Just on a very basic human level, that's something we all need. Male, female, all of it. We need human connection.
Well, and even to that point too, George, I think it also illustrates to you. You show me your schedule, and I'll show you what means a lot to you. Just like, your schedule, your bank account, your checkbook. You often put attention to things that mean something to you. And it's very easy to write off a quick comment, a quick post, a quick text, and go on about your day versus getting on the phone or having a face-to-face or a Zoom-like conversation where you have that rest of that 95% of communication in play. And all it costs you is just a little more time. And I think people can pick up on real quickly, despite the world we live in with social media and smartphones and text messages, the fact that you're willing to spend time of your day to better hear somebody out and have a conversation. I think that actually speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Because most people aren't willing to do that.
Yeah. You're demonstrating, you're affirming that person's value with that extra little bit of time and thought and effort.
Mm-hmm. You hit the nail on the head too, because you look at the time and money. Obviously, money is a factor of time. And so when you look at where somebody's time is being placed, you know exactly what their importance, their priorities, their idolizations are. And, you were talking about step 4 and 5, winning the battle and losing the war. I can tell you a perfect example where I see that on a daily basis is marriages. People have a constant, I would rather win the war or win the battle right now and lose the entire war. It's like, what good is it for you to be right and die on this small hill and then lose your marriage? Mm-hmm. And, people do it every day, and it's a pure selfish motivation, lack of empathy, lack of trying to sit down and spend time with that person and work through what you need to. And like you said, if you're honorable about it, then you are going to sit down, you're going to spend that time, you're going to prioritize it. And it makes all the difference in the world in a relationship, especially when you're doing it consistently. Mm-hmm. I've heard people say at least 90 minutes to 120 minutes a week of maintenance. That's just maintenance time for you and your wife to stay together. And so I love those steps. But, you talked about social media, and you kind of gave way into a little bit about our faith specifically. So I wanted to ask you, how did your Christian faith transform you from a liberal into a conservative within the Black community?
Sure. So I think part of what comes off top of mind, we were talking about identity politics beforehand. I grew up in the South where the thought was, voting Democrat, you didn't question it. That's just what Black people in the South do. And I think that held the test of time for me up until about 2016. I did something that was pretty foreign. I looked at the platforms of both parties. And I recognized at that point in time that my faith was very much growing as a Christian, and I wanted to be more like Jesus. And a lot of what the Bible had to say was becoming more and more important to me as I was growing up as a young man. I recognized that one platform was closer to what I was trying to be more like than the other. One platform was being more closer to the convictions I had as a Christian. May not be completely 100% right in
Sure.
line, but from a comparison standpoint, I felt more intact with who I was as a believer than with the other party. And so I think that's what led me to say, yeah, I actually see myself as more conservative. And the other part of it, too, is the thought of even beyond just politically speaking, guys, in 2024, if you are a Christian, so to speak, and you believe that what the Bible says is true and that it should be followed as not his truth or her truth, it's the truth. It's like the standard of right and wrong. I'm sorry to burst anybody's bubble here, but if you truly believe that and you apply that in your day-to-day life, well, guess what that makes you? That makes you a conservative. So even beyond politics, like conservative, the whole essence is you're trying to conserve something, keep something that has worked before. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's certain traditions or things of the past that you're trying to hold on to because it works. It's the right way to go. You believe in it. You love it and that sort, right? Mm-hmm. I want to conserve what I was raised off of that I feel like is the right way to go. And so I think that what it did was it helped me understand that, from an identity standpoint, I shouldn't look at myself as, oh, I am a African American heterosexual male from the South who's a Christian, da 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 da. It's like, no, my identity starts as a follower of Jesus Christ. And then everything beyond that is secondary. That is what's most important. My faith is what's most important. That's what defines me, not any of these other check boxes that a lot of people are going off of. And when I had that shift in focus, that's what really helped me see things in a different light than before.
When you, oh, go ahead, Brandon.
So I was going to ask you. You wrote Jesus over Black, and that I think that kind of falls into the line of what you're discussing right now. Can you go into that a little bit, like why you wrote that book and how it ties to your faith and what the community itself is believing as a whole?
Yeah, so I think between Disagree Over Disrespect and Jesus Over Black, those are I've written a number of books, but those two books are the most personally significant to me. I think Jesus Over Black was one where, the subtitle literally is how my faith transformed me from a liberal to conservative within the Black community. And I think basically what was going on there was it was a deeper dive into my faith and what was most important to me. Like, as I talked about before, as I approach 40, you start to take inventory of what your life was about, good, bad, and ugly. What were the major lessons learned? And one of the major lessons learned for me was some of the things that were important to me when I was 20 and 30 are not the same things that was important to me as I'm 40. As a father and as a father of, twin daughters and married for 8 years to one woman, certain things become more important. And it's more so a sense of trying to reflect a lot of what the Bible says is what a family should be about, and being able to impart that to my kids, as the book of Deuteronomy would talk about as far as what a father should do as far as instruction of the Lord, as far as like you are actually playing a significant role
Yeah.
in passing it on. It's not so much the wife, it's not so much the mother, it's the
It's your
husband, it's the
responsibility.
father. But no one's really talking about that. That's some important,
Well, we are, but
well, yes, there's some important Bible verses we'll memorize, but there's something when I go through my morning Bible read, I'm thinking to myself, oh no, well, some churches they don't preach on that one. They don't
Yeah.
they don't share that passage. That's important.
oh man, we're gonna have to do a whole second episode on that topic.
Of course, but it's also like you're thinking to yourself, like, as a father, I'm big on believing that, my family is my first ministry.
Yes, 100%.
And that's that role you're taking of itself. And you're in a culture now where a lot of people are trying to redefine what a man should be, what a husband should be, what a father should be, what a family should be. And getting back to the book of Jesus over Black, it's like, I'm not letting a culture tell me what my role should be anymore. I'm going off of what this one book 2,000 plus years ago, the word of God, what is it saying? Because I know one thing. God created me the way that I am. And if anything, I'm going to look towards the creator on how I should be rather than the creation.
Yeah.
And so the thought comes off as Jesus for me should be my Lord and Savior, not just a wish genie as far as like, oh,
Right.
well, I'll give you certain portions of
Exactly.
it, but other things, no. It's like, no, that should be the barometer, not one of the barometers. It should be the
Right.
barometer. And so,
Yeah, it's the heading. It's all of your values and morals are derived from what he says, right?
and so the thought becomes, it says Jesus over Black, but the other part of the message is that the book should also help people understand it should be Jesus over everything.
Right.
Jesus over Black, Jesus over white, Jesus over
Yep.
Hispanic, Jesus over Republican, Jesus over Democrat, Jesus over America, Jesus over England, Jesus over everything. That should be the most important thing that defines us. And the other thing, too, is as much as it defines you, it also is a great way to unify us. Jesus is the great unifier ultimately, because it talks about in the book of Revelation, every tongue, tribe, nation, right? It's that sort of thing where it's like it brings people together under a common ground, a commonality. And it's not based off of what you and I look like. It's not based on where we grew up. It's not based on what sports team we like. It's something much bigger, much more significant. So I think the book is just really digging deep on that and getting really clear on what it should be about, making the main thing the main thing.
Have you received a lot of backlash after, kind of changing from liberal to conservative and coming from the Black community and saying what you're saying? And assuming with the title of that book too, you probably ruffled some feathers. What's that been like?
So the funny thing is no. And I have my thoughts on why. One, I try to talk like I have some sense. Right? It's when you talk about intellectual curiosity and that sort of thing, it's like I come about things in a way that you can't just completely write off as like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right. You're not being like hyperbolic or sensationalist or whatever. Yeah.
No, and the other part of it too, I also understand identity politics in a way to understand, you know what? It's hard to put a Black man down that's having these type of thoughts without actually putting a mirror on yourself at the same time. Right? So within the Black community, it's like if I'm saying this sort of thing as a Christian, well, guess what? The mirror I already know in the back of my mind, when you criticize me, there's a mirror that comes back at you. It's like, well, if you're a fellow Christian, what is Philip saying? And does that apply to you too? Do you look at things where Jesus first in your life? Or is it somebody or something else? We all worship something or someone. The question is, who or what are we worshiping? And so I think part of what goes on is I'm sure there's probably more feedback on what I say or believe that I don't hear of, right? Rather than it being public or in my face or present, that sort. And that's fine. I also know there's some that comes out more publicly. I think that what helps is it's just recognizing that I feel like something's changing. Particularly this year, something's changing. I think that when you have one political party that is publicly sharing with you where their cards are at,
Yeah.
what the agenda is, and you look at that just from me as a Christian, what the word says, and you're like, it kind of talks about in this book already some of these type of things that
Yeah.
people are doing. And you kind of recognize yourself, that's not where we're supposed to be going as a society. I kind of see where things are going if we keep going down this route. You start saying to yourself, you know what? It's not about the quote unquote right side of history. It's more so on who's on the right side with God.
Right.
And I don't want to be on the right side of history and be on the wrong side of God.
Right.
And
Definitely.
so I think what goes on there is the question of, you have to be careful to come against somebody that looks like you but is not basing it on what you see, but it's more based on something even bigger than me. Because it's a lot tougher to come at me and you have Jesus as your advocate.
Yeah.
And you're basing it not just based on Philip's philosophy. It's no, like, my thing is hinged on the word of God that predated every one of us
Yeah.
and will be with us after every one of us have passed on. That takes a certain sense of arrogance, I would imagine, to come against that, because it's not really against me anymore. You're actually coming against God in this sense.
Right.
And God bless you on how you go about that, because
Yeah.
that's not a place I will want to be.
Just follow up question to that. For any man, well, really anyone, looking to make a change, what has been your experience, and what is your advice for, and not just a political question, but any kind of growth where you're going to have critics or people tell you shouldn't do this or whatever, right? Try and keep you in your little box, and that you need to change something for yourself. What are some of the ways in which a person can build that strength of will to reject or resist against kind of those who would not want to see you change? And obviously, you're a very well-educated man. You've worked in a lot of different fields. You have a ton of experience across a lot of different areas. I think your perspective will be very helpful for a lot of different people on that.
Yeah, so I think one thing that comes to the top of mind, George, is I'm not hinging off of where I went to school, right? I'm hinging off of a book that's accessible to anybody who wants it.
Right.
Right? So that takes things down several notches. But to your point, I think the best thing you can go about this is to realize you shouldn't go about this pathway alone. Because I would imagine that's exactly what the enemy will want you to do. Because you're much easier to pick off, as opposed to getting deep into the word, where it's like, for me, like a big thing for me is I do a 1-year Bible reading plan where I'm reading multiple books of the Bible each morning with the goal of completing it at the end of the year, and I'll do it again. And the reason why that's so important to me, at least, is that I believe that, you should hear from God more than just Sunday morning. What you hear Sunday morning should not be the only time you hear from God or read from
Right.
God, right? And it's upon ourselves as men, if our family is truly our first ministry, your wife, your kids should be looking upon to you to provide that sort of instruction beyond Sunday morning. where's your source coming from then that
Yeah.
you're going to draw from? It can't be from ESPN, you
Definitely
know?
not.
So that's a big part of it too. Is like, yeah, you're bucking the trend, but it's helpful to know this is not so much George going about it alone or Brandon. There's a source that you're drawing it from. And then even more so, that's dealing with your vertical relationship with God.
Hmm.
But there's also horizontal relationship too with fellow believers that as men to congregate and support one another that are unified in Christ. That is a significant source to draw from as well.
One last little follow up on this. I get the sense today that most men are waiting for permission to do anything, especially when it comes to like making a good decision, like a right decision, even in the face of opposition. What would you say to those men who are so paralyzed by fear of judgment, or just stuck in a state of inaction, to find the resolve to just start making movement?
So I think to paraphrase a quote that I often come back to, George, is to paraphrase, to avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing. You may not get criticized from the outside, but trust and believe you'll face your own inner critic as far as how you spend your life and what you do with your time here. Because trust and believe God's going to want an accounting from all of us as far as what did we do with our time here. And so last time I checked, none of these critics that I see on the outside are going to be out sitting next to me, standing next to me in front of God when it's all said and done. So that really puts a lot of perspective on how much weight I give to quote unquote critics.
Right.
And with that being said, I say, listen, you being paralyzed, is that coming from God or is that coming from somebody else? And how much control are you going to let that person or that force have a hold on your life? I think that kind of helps too. It's me being quiet, me being timid, is me allowing society to define for me how I should go about things as a man. Do I let that have the ruling say so? Or do I go through something, or do I go to something that trumps society, that trumps culture, that trumps what you hear on social media? And that's why that source is so important. It has to be something that is reliable, that has stood the test of time, that is seen as the standard of truth, and that is backed by something and someone that is much greater than either one of us, because it's backed by something that created us.
Thank you.
I think that also, to put it into perspective, if we're going to anchor ourselves in Christ on a daily basis, we have to remember that we would never be honored on a planet where our Lord was crucified, right? And so, he does talk about making a table for thine enemies, and that he is the justice bringer. And so, for me personally, I don't let the critiques of others bother me, because, it's like the whole, a lion does not be bothered by the opinions of a sheep, right? And, if you're going to hold yourself to a higher standard, you can't allow people that are not holding themselves to that standard criticize and bring you back down to their level, right? You don't want that. So I agree 100%. But I think one of the biggest things that's plaguing us right now, besides the fear of criticism, is just the lack of mentorship, the lack of fathers. And so my question to you right now is, why is why is fatherlessness our biggest crisis to solve in our culture and our society right now?
So you heard me talk about how as husbands and fathers, our family is the first ministry. There's a reason behind that, because we just talked about identity. Mm-hmm. And the question that comes up top of mind for me is, where do people first usually go to when they try to figure out, who am I?
Their dad.
They go to
Parents,
they
yeah.
go to their parents. So if one half of the equation, as far as their parents, is missing, how do you solve that question? And so what leads a lot of people to think in terms of like, if I don't have that sort of presence of a father, that instruction, that love of a father, that guidance of a father, um, you're going to be trying to figure out how to fill that void, even if it doesn't involve your actual father. So you may look at things outside of your family, outside of your home, to try to make up that void. And oftentimes, it's going to come from unhealthy places, perverted places, right? And so, that being said, the other thing I share too is the thought that take it one step further, Brandon. Imagine how your life would be like if you didn't have a heavenly father.
That's the definition of hell. Separation from God, right? I mean, it would be absolute hell. There wouldn't be any grace. There wouldn't have been any place where he interjected himself to protect me when I didn't know better. You know, when I failed, there wouldn't be any kind of mercy. It would be just consequence and punishment.
So your earthly father is clearly not on that same level as a heavenly father, right? But that is about as close to a parallel as you can get to understand why fatherlessness is such a significant issue, because there's so much connected to you from where you come from. And your father should be seen as an under shepherd of you. And Jesus had compassion on those who were lost because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So we have compassion to those who are fatherless because they are like sheep without a shepherd, whether a earthly father or a heavenly father. And that's what I think really brings it home as far as an issue that most people don't talk about. But when you take the time to think it through, that's why fatherlessness is so significant.
Yeah. And I think like one additional factor that's making it more problematic is not just that the direct father is not there and not involved in the equation so often now. It's also men in general are so paralyzed that they're afraid to even step into that role from like a societal point of view, right? Like if a kid is acting out at the playground, well, it's not my kid, it's not my place to say anything. No, man, we're standard bearers everywhere we go, right? We should be bringing goodness everywhere we go. And it's not rude or anything to make a gentle correction to a kid who's acting out or something. That's being a good steward of the next generation. And to all the men out there, maybe you're not a dad right now, or maybe your kids are grown and they've moved out. What are you doing to help the next generation to pour into other young men who need it? Because there is such a huge gap right now. We need to start stepping into it. You know, and this is something I've personally been reflecting a lot on is, you know, how do I play a more involved role with like my nephew and his cousins and things like that. You know, like there's a lot of younger, you know, boys currently or young men who could use help that I could be giving to them more consistently that I haven't been in the past. And so I'm speaking to myself and to all the men listening, you know, think about who you could start playing that role in. It may not solve the whole problem, but every little bit we start chipping away at this thing, you know, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So we need to start taking little chunks out together collectively. And I think men, we just need to step up across the board. And so Philip, the way that you talked about this really teed up very well. What I want to get into next is you'd said, hey, you're almost 40 now. You've been thinking about kind of what does the rest look like? And so we love to ask the question about legacy. And, you know, I'd love to hear, what does legacy really mean to you? And what is the specific legacy you are trying to build with the rest of the time that you have?
So I think a big part of it is I feel like I'm a legacy of those who came before me, in particular that raised me. And from a male perspective, it was my grandfather. And so the legacy that comes off is, We talk about inheritances, heirlooms, generational shifts, gifts, curses, that sort of thing. Um, my kids will never know who their great grandfather was. The closest proxy they'll get, though, is their experience with their father. And so when I think about legacy, is the thought that, once again, conserving something that you believe is true and right and is worth conserving. A lot of what I learned from my grandfather first, how to be a godly man, I want to be able to reflect that to the best of my ability to my own family, as far as to my wife and to my children. Because they're my first ministry, I realize I need to get that right before I extend out to anywhere else. And at the same time, to your point, George, if I get that right as well, I believe God will bless me with opportunities to be a blessing to other people, even outside of my household. To those who don't have that in their homes, don't have that sort of example or that love or that guidance, trusting God to provide the right opportunities to do that, because I grew up needing a present father, right? That was not in the house with me. I had to look elsewhere, father figures, right, outside of my grandfather. So when I think about legacy, it's more so the sense of, once again, we're in a very perverse society, a very polarized society, a very more secularized society that wants to get away from God, that wants to get away from what the Word of God says. And part of that legacy for me is not rebelling against God, but rebelling against this culture in society to say, no, like, what God had brought for us is right. Anything against what God had originally intended is wrong. And if anything else, I need to do my part to be a good and faithful steward, to share what God had intended for us, not only to make sure that I'm doing right individually, but also to help grow my family on the right path, my church, my community, and work alongside other godly men to really bring heaven onto earth, as far as expanding God's kingdom the way He intended it, until Jesus comes back again.
And you've said it numerous times that our family is our first ministry. And so there's a verse that directly speaks to that. It's, anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially for their own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's 1 Timothy 5:8. So men, there's so many distractions, right? Oh, get the job, get this, get the thing, do the thing, get to this point, and so often we sacrifice our family on the altar of success, right? That's kind of the American way today. And it's a lie. And the first and most important legacy you need to build is the strength of the relationships in your own home. That investment that you will make, you may never see it, right? You're planting the seeds of trees you will never sit under the shade for, but that will leave such an impact on the world. It'll far surpass things or businesses or how many sports ball games you won, right? It's the real investment into future generations. So Phil, appreciate that so much, man. And Brandon's going to take us away with our final question for you.
Yeah. So legacy obviously allows us to enjoy the fruits of our labor, so to speak, and it creates great core memories. And one of our questions we always ask everybody is, what is just one of the tremendously great core memories that you have with your children and your fatherhood journey?
So I don't remember my father brushing my teeth and reading me stories before I go to bed. I don't remember that. And I think that with my kids being of age where they do remember, the thought that comes to my head is the thought that my kids, as they get older, they're going to remember me, whether I was present or not. whether I was loving or not. And something as simple as brushing my girls' teeth before they go to bed and being a part of story time before they go to bed and praying over them each night consistently. I think that that's something that is a core memory that I think will stick with me. And I also believe will stick with them as they get older and become young women and they become wives and they become mothers. They'll remember those moments as well.
I love that, man. That's so beautiful. You know, you're directly healing what you didn't have, right? You're fixing the wrongs, and I agree with you. It's those little things that are going to shape them in such amazing ways. Yeah, I love it. I'm just like reflecting on all the little things I do with my daughter, right? And it just we I think often we get deceived that it's some big gesture we're going to make, right? And that's the stuff that matters most. And in reality, it's these tiny little things over and over and over again that seem insignificant, but they're really not in the grand scheme of things. So I love that one. It's a great reminder for us to really focus on those moments and really lean into them when we have the opportunity, because there's always, you know, quote unquote, more important things to do, right? Work's there, or, you know, your marriage, or there's all these other things that are on the table, probably stressing us out or we're tired from. But those little moments like that are truly magical. And that's kind of like the power that us as dads get to provide. So I love that one a lot, man. Mm-hmm. Philip, where can people follow you? Where can they support you? How can we help you moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, guys. You know, for any of the books, Disagree Without Disrespect or Jesus Over Black, they're both available on Amazon. You can look them up by title or just look them up by my name, Philip Blackett, Philip Blackett. There you'll be able to see those two books along with some other books I've written. You can also connect with me on my website, philipblackett.com, or just reach out on social media. Just look up my name, Philip Blackett, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. I'll be there.
And we will put links to everything in the description, whichever platform you're on, so you can go click those and make it nice and easy to reach out to Philip. Philip, any closing thoughts for the audience?
So I think the big thing I always think about is, you know, I love listening to podcasts, and oftentimes if I don't catch myself, I'll listen to a podcast, and once it concludes, I'll click it off, and I'll go ahead and move on to something else. I think that we've covered a lot here in this short time together that I think if anybody listening could just take away one thing to do today and apply it either as a husband or as a father or as a man of God, I say make sure the sun doesn't set before you actually figure out what you're going to do as a result of listening to this episode.
I love that. You got to take action, man. Got to put it into practice. Philip, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your heart for helping others and outlining such a great framework for us to disagree without being disrespectful. I love that very much, man. Just God bless, and looking forward to connecting with you in the future and continuing to watch your journey as well. So, all right, dads, you heard it here. Let's take action. Let's get climbing that mountain of fatherhood. We will see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching this episode of the podcast. If you're on YouTube, drop a subscription to us, and if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a review. It helps greatly. If you are also ready to level up as a man, check out Elite Sentinel Coaching, our program designed specifically for men, where we forge men into leaders. We turn cowards into kings, weaklings into warriors. Become the hero in your story. Join us today.